Okay, we're going to continue with subsession 2 of the Plant Sciences session with a talk by Ellen Cypher. I thought it was California Department of Fish and Wildlife, is that right?
Both. I recently retired.
Oh, okay, and California State University Stanislaus. Speaking on host relationships of the endangered plant palmate salty bird's beak at Alkali Sink Ecological Reserve.
Is the mic okay for me? Yes. Okay, and if you'll notice, I also changed my title a little bit from what is in your program because I wanted, I shortened it up for the program, but I do want to emphasize this is a field study at a single site. And this is my study species, our study species, palmate salty bird's beak. Currently goes by the scientific name Chloropyron palmatum. Either the common or the scientific name are kind of a mouthful, and I only have 15 minutes, so I'm mostly going to say C. palmatum throughout my talk. This is a federally and state listed endangered species, which is why we care about it. It is endemic to the Great Valley floristic region, and our study site was the southernmost known occurrence at Alkali Sink Ecological Reserve. It is endemic to alkali sink habitats. This is a typical one showing the mineral deposits on the surface. The primary reason the species is endangered is due to habitat loss because most of the former alkali sink in the San Joaquin Valley, or the Central Valley, looks something like this. I want to talk a little bit about the life history of C. palmatum, and it is here in the center. It's a summer annual, so most of our annuals grow in the spring and die back, and they're already brown in the summertime, like the annual grasses you see here. C. palmatum continues growing through the summer and setting seed during the summer months, and the reason it's able to do that is because it's a hemiparasite. So it's green, obviously has chlorophyll, produces its own food, but it taps into adjacent plants and to absorb water and nutrients, and those plants are known as host plants. You can see a variety of plant species around this that appear to be alive, but we were curious to which one of those might actually be hosts. So our questions are whether C. palmatum is more likely to occur with certain potential host plants, and whether any of those host plants might improve survival or reproduction of C. palmatum. This is our study site, Alkali Sink Ecological Reserve, which is managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this is the portion of the ecological reserve where the C. palmatum occurred during the years we studied it. We've studied it on and off since 1998 as funding was available. And when we began the study, the only place it was known to occur was in that larger rectangle. A few years later, we did fund it down there. But initially, to answer the question about the distribution and whether C. palmatum occurred in proximity to any particular host plants, we just distributed random points throughout this large rectangle and looked within 2 meters of each random point to identify which perennial plant species occurred there and whether C. palmatum occurred there. We actually did this in half-meter increments, so I'll just mention a little bit later on briefly about the difference between the half-meter and 2 meters. These are the species that we encountered within 2 meters of our random points: saltgrass, Stickless bicava, alkali heath, Brancania salina, iodine bush, Allenrolfia occidentalis, bush seepweed, Sueda nigra, and rusty molly, Cochia californica. This may not be familiar to everyone. It is also an Echinopodiaceae, as is Sueda, and it looks pretty much like a hairy version of Sueda. This is a native species, as are all of the ones that we found within 2 meters of perennials. So I put the results for all 5 of those perennial species. So this shows the percentage of our random points where the species occurred with C. palmatum. Those are the green bars, and how it's a proportion overall of the random points. And you don't need to look at all the numbers, but the first thing you're going to notice that only 2 of the species really occurred with any frequency in our study area, or at our random points. And the second thing you might notice is that Allenrolfia didn't occur at all with C. palmatum at our random points. And in fact, 3 of these species, Allenrolfia, Stickless, and Brancania, were uncommon enough that we didn't have enough points to run statistical tests. But for Kochia and Sueda, there was no difference in occurrence with C. palmatum overall. So we would say that C. palmatum occurred with these species in proportion to their abundance. We were fortunate in some years to have enough funding to actually track seedlings or individual C. palmatum plants from the seedling stage, and this is the little C. palmatum seedling, through reproductive maturity. And that was how we got at the question of survival and reproduction. And here the green bars represent where this potential host species is present, the gray bars are where it's absent. And by definition, C. palmatum was at every one of these points. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the only species for which there was a higher survival rate in the presence of that species was Frankenia, and this was in 1998. We repeated that work in 2005, and we actually found that 2 of the potential hosts seemed to be associated with higher survival rates, or were associated with higher survival rates of C. palmatum, and that was both Frankenia and Kochia. Well, you might wonder why there's a difference between the 2 years. Well, for one thing, we did have a change in methodology, but there was survival overall was more than 30% on average in 1998 for C. palmatum seedlings to reproductive maturity. In 2005, it was less than 10%, so that's quite a difference. One thing we did notice between those 2 years was the rainfall. So during the growing season of 1997-1998, we had almost double the long-term average rainfall for the site. And 2005 was actually above average for the rainfall, but considerably below the rainfall we had in 1998, which might suggest that the hosts become more important in drier years when we don't have the amount of ambient water. Well, as I mentioned, we tracked C. palmatum to reproductive maturity. We actually had several different measures of reproductive performance, and I'm not going to present them all because they had similar results. What I am going to talk about is fruit production, and really this is literally measured, if you look on the y-axis, of the length of the stalk of C. palmatum, this is the median over the plants, so that was producing fruits which were producing seeds, so the ones that actually were successful in reproducing. It's just the length, but we've tried this with several different measures and they all show the same thing. And in terms of, again, this is the green bars are where the host is present, the gray bars where it's absent. Only Frankenia was statistically significant in terms of influencing fruit production by host, and it greatly increased fruit production. If you're looking at these bars, it's really interesting that it looks like in the absence of Disticus, we actually had better fruit production by C. palmatum. But it's not statistically significant, so I'm not going to speculate on it, but it would really be an interesting avenue for future research. Of course, it's entirely possible that C. palmatum and these potential host species are both responding to some environmental variable that we didn't measure, and it's not the presence of the host that's affecting the survival or reproductive performance of the C. palmatum. Another indication that it probably does have something to do with the presence of host species was we looked at the number of woody host species within a half a meter. Oh, and I forgot to mention, when we did the analysis, when we did our first random distribution study, we looked at half a meter, 1 meter, 1.5, 2, and there was no difference in distribution at the different distances. So everything else after that, we just looked within a half a meter for potential hosts. But anyway, this is not the number of individual plants, but it's the number of different species. And 1 or 2 species really didn't make any difference in the fruit production, but when you had 3 different woody host species, and Disticus wasn't included in this, so just 3 different woody host species, we had significantly higher reproduction by C. palmatum. So it does seem that the presence of hosts, whatever they are, is it improving reproduction by C. palmatum. So just to summarize that, and I forgot to look for numbers, C. palmatum was randomly distributed with respect to potential hosts. It did have higher survival and reproduction in the presence of Coquia or Frankenia, depending on which measure we looked at. The presence of 3 woody species was more beneficial than 1 or 2. Now, I've already shown you how that can vary between 2 years, and I'm sure it's different among different sites. So I wouldn't try to extrapolate this to anywhere else besides St. Ecological Reserve or the nearby areas. But for that area, we would recommend management for shrub diversity may be beneficial. And reintroduction of C. palmatum is extremely difficult. It's an endangered species. The geographic range is fairly big, but many of the southern populations are very small. So we would like to see it reintroduced, but it's very difficult to do. But if we were going to try it in the southern part of the range, we would suggest alkali sinks with abundant diverse shrubs. As preferred sites, there are certainly plenty of other factors that would have to be taken into account, environmental integrity, threats, and so on. But certainly having an abundance of diversity of shrubs would be helpful. I want to show you again our heroes, Frankenia and Coquia. Acknowledged funding from your recommendation, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the many field staff who helped over many years, and other contributions by our partners at California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I guess I have time for questions. I haven't even seen the number held up yet. See, I told you about that. Yes, sir.
Has anybody looked at current data, given the drought and so on? I noticed that the data set mostly from the 1990s, which is great to have and so on. Is anybody still continuing to collect that data?
Not the intensive data that we collected in those years. We have some more recent data on population trends, and the population is holding its own. I'm a little bit surprised there are a number of disturbance factors there. But even in 2013, when it was quite a dry year, during the drought, the population was actually higher than it had, almost as higher than it had been since that extremely wet year of 1998. So. But anyway, we haven't had the funding to do the intensive monitoring that we did during those 3 years. Yes, sir?
You mentioned a 4th host species too, besides Disticus and Coquia, and what was the 4th one?
Well, we found Ellen there, but we did not find anything within 2 meters of C. palmatum. And in fact, when we were tracking our plants in later years, there wasn't any of it in proximity. And in fact, one other species I didn't even show you was Sporobolus aeroides. So they're the native perennial grass, that bunch grass, that we found on the site, but it was so in such low numbers I didn't even show it to you, and it did not ever occur with C. palmatum.
We've got a site that where the species is in decline with only Disticus present. Do you have any suggestions of how we can improve that? We don't have any shrubs at all, any woody species.
That's where I'm a little reluctant, because I don't know where your site is, because there's some other circumstantial evidence that Disticus may be a host, like at the in Livermore area for the population up there. So some of the work that was done back in the 1990s. So I'm reluctant. I mean, there's also Alanolfi at that site, but they thought that perhaps Disticus was a host. But certainly at our site, it's not that commonly occurring with C. palmatum, and again, did not seem to be contributing at all to improved survival and reproduction. So I'm reluctant to tell you what to do on your site without site-specific studies. All right, thank you very much.